Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Top 5 Financial Metrics for AE Firms. Your presenters today are Brad Wilson and Lisa Lee. Just moving on to a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Brad and Lisa. You can customize what you're seeing on the GoToWebinar screen viewer this afternoon, whether you want to make the presentation bigger or the webcams bigger. And you can also toggle with your audio options. We do offer a computer audio as well as a dial-in option. We do find that the dial-in option is a little bit more reliable, so if you have any issues, you can try toggling between the two to find which audio option is the best for you. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please drop them into the questions panel as we do not monitor the chat box featured during the webinar. We will have one polling question just to give our presenters a little bit of background so they can better speak to our topic this afternoon. And survey responses, they're exciting. We look at all of them. We look at all the data that we get from them. And if you have any questions that were not answered during the presentation that pop into your mind after, please insert them in there and we will work on getting back to you personally. And this is our third webinar in this series. We have 3 of them out there, and the first 2, Common Accounting Mistakes AE Firms Make and Project Accounting Basics for AE Firms, are both out there on our on-demand section of our website at stamboness.com. And if you attended all 3 live, we would love to offer you a free 30-minute consultation with our experts, Brad and Lisa. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Brad to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Maybe this is not the first one of these in the series that you've attended, so I always try to vary my introduction a little bit. Maybe you've heard this before. Hopefully you're tuning in regularly to Stamboness programs. My background is finance, but I've spent my entire career working in the AE industry, either inside firms as a internal financial manager like many of you, or as an outside consultant as I am right now. The interest in this section is that it builds on the information from the previous 2 webinars so that you're doing your accounting correctly, you're watching your projects properly, and you're tracking the proper metrics. I've found in my consulting career that this is a major issue for a lot of firms that are using non-AE specific software. You just can't get the numbers arranged properly to do that, and that has been kind of a passion for me during my consulting career here, making sure that you all get the right information. So Lisa and I are going to share what some of that information looks like this afternoon. So I'll kick it over to Lisa. She can tell you a little bit about herself.
Good afternoon. As Brad mentioned, my name is Lisa Lee. I lead the outsourced accounting services team here at Stamboness. We're a team of accountants with expertise in the architectural and engineering industry, as well as with Vision and Vantage Point software. We support clients with their internal accounting tasks, and we also help make their internal and external processes more efficient. And as Brad mentioned with himself, I have worked within the industry for the last 15 or 20 years as a controller at a mid-sized engineering firm, and now also as director of the outsourced accounting services here at Stamboness. So back to you, Brad.
Great. Well, first question, what do you all use? Kaylee mentioned there at the introduction that we'd like to have a little information about you so that we can speak to your particular situation, and depending on how you answer this polling question could determine for a large degree how you're able to calculate these metrics, how you're able to distill them out of your system. So if you would please, I think the poll has been opened now. Kaylee's got it open. So if you would please go through here and give us your answers about what you're currently using.
Alrighty, it looks like everybody is tuned in with us this afternoon. We already have 81% voted, so I'll give you a few more seconds to cast your vote. But it looks like the ever so popular Vision Vantage Point platform is in the lead currently. I'm going to go ahead and close and share the results with everybody to see. So it looks like 5% say they use just QuickBooks alone, 7% use that QuickBooks Plus an add-on, 46% use Vision Vantage Point, 29% use the Ajira ERP platform, and 12% use other. So if you answered other, we'd be curious to know what that is. So drop that in the questions panel so we can review that after the presentation.
Great. Thanks a lot, Kaylee. So this webinar is about details, about blocking and tackling, calculating, figuring out what these metrics teach you, how to use them, how to impact them. But I do want to spend just a couple of minutes here talking about, well, first off, why do we call these the Big Five? And then what's the purpose behind all this? You know, Lisa and I are going to share 5 metrics we think you should know, and your proper answer could be, so what? So what does that do for us? Understand that measuring the metrics is not the goal. It's the tool to use to influence the performance of your firm. The goal is to identify particularly easily calculated metrics, KPIs, key performance indicators, they call them, that once you've started to maintain a history of tracking, you can start to figure out what behaviors are going on inside your firm that cause those metrics to go up and down. And as you'll hear, many of these metrics are interrelated. You can't change one without changing the other. And understanding that interrelation means that you kind of look at them holistically. Now, there's hundreds, honestly, and we find lots of clients, I'm sure Lisa, you would agree, tracking way too many metrics. You can have hundreds. I mean, I've got some clients that have got 3 or 4 pages monthly of metrics, and they start to, it's not that all of them aren't important, but they start to sink under the volume, under the weight of all that information. Just for this afternoon, for a 30-minute webinar, we've tried to boil down 5 that we think are absolutely necessary and give you a holistic enough approach or viewpoint of your firm so that you're not surprised by unintentional consequences of trying to manipulate one or the other. And what we mean by that is these 5 are interconnected in ways that are, easily understood, somewhat transparent. There's not a whole lot of math behind it. Now, it does depend on the way in which you do accounting. And if you remember back, if you've attended, or please go to the recorded version of webinar number 1, if you're not doing AE specific breakdowns of your numbers in your general ledger, and by that I mean direct and indirect labor, net and gross fees, proper classification of overhead versus direct expenses and all of that, some of these metrics might be a little off for you, or you might have trouble calculating them all together. With almost half of the attendees using Vision Vantage Point, I think you're probably pretty safe in all of that, and we'll be talking about why these Big 5 are the Big 5, as opposed to how they're calculated or how you have to rearrange your accounting system in order to get them. But without further ado, I want to introduce what we're calling the Big 5, okay? Lisa's going to talk here in a little bit to lead off about utilization and multiplier, and we consider those to be foundational. Those are 2 things that really those are not optional. There's no other calculations necessary in order to calculate those 2. But then we get into 3 others: revenue factor, overhead rate, and net cash flow per full-time equivalent, or net revenue per full-time equivalent, both kind of the same, that depend on proper calculation of the first 2 in some way. And that's where we start to get this interconnectedness and how these metrics influence each other, and how it's very difficult to look at one kind of in a vacuum and make changes to it without understanding how the other KPIs, the other Big 5 metrics, could be influenced or impacted, so that you can look at them as a single set, a single goal, to make sure that they move appropriately. Some of them, as you'll hear, higher is better. In some cases, lower is better. And in many cases, we'll talk a little bit about using these at the end of the program. Benchmarking these against other similar firms is also a crucial part of the process. So with that, I'll give it to Lisa. She's going to explain about utilization rate, the first metric.
Thanks, Brad. So utilization rate, like Brad mentioned, is pretty much one of the basic rates that most firms do actually look at, whether they're actually using it in tandem with the other ones that we're going to discuss. Sometimes not, but it's a simple calculation. Is taking your total direct labor cost, or total labor that's posted to regular type projects that you're going to bill, divided by your total labor cost. So there's some things that you want to make sure are happening in order to make sure these numbers are correct. One is, like Brad mentioned, have a system that can track them, but also making sure all of your employees are actually entering all of their hours that they're working, including their overhead hours. If you're not recording all of your hours, you're not really getting true information. And then again, it's what's worth tracking if you're not really getting, real information. But it represents the percentage of total labor costs that are spent on projects. So that's pretty simple. The desirable average rate for your whole firm, looking at administrative staff, your billers, your accounting staff, whatever, is 60 to 65%. And the average rate for direct employees, or employees that you're expecting to work on projects, is between 75 and 85%. So some things to think about that influence the utilization rate. The utilization rate itself doesn't really correspond to profitability in and of itself. People can charge a lot of time to projects, and if they are not able to bill that time, it's not going to be profitable. If you overemphasize just the utilization rate, and that's one thing that you kind of keep in the forefront of your employees without consideration for the remainder that we're going to be talking about, it can actually be a negative, because they may be starting to charge time to those regular type projects that they're not maybe working, just to make their utilization look better. So actions you can take to improve your utilization rate: obviously keep your pipeline full. That's what everybody likes to do, of course. So doing that, as well as keeping your schedule, your employees scheduled. If you're not using any type of scheduling software, that also helps keep your utilization high, because people know what they're supposed to be working on. They don't have to wait, for somebody to come and give them information for an hour or two to get them started on their next project. The other thing that you can do is people who are highly costed, like principals or directors, if they are engaged in projects, that will also keep your utilization rate up, and you'll be able to charge more on your projects because they are more billed at a higher rate. So the next one we're going to look at, the net fee multiplier. You can also, I've heard this called the net labor multiplier as well. So this again is pretty much a very easy calculation, is your net revenue divided by your total direct labor. So one way you can think about it is every dollar that you spend in direct labor, your fee multiplier is how many dollars that you're going to be able to bill. So if I was charging $1, make it simple, to direct labor, I could bill $3 in revenue on that. So here we have 3 or higher is typical in successful firms. We actually see, at least I'm sure Brad does as well, in the 4 range is really especially for maybe architects or specialized firms. But the higher that is, obviously the better. Like Brad said, some are good high, some are better if they're lower. But if you think about it, if you're having people driving the utilization rate up without looking at this, your net fee multiplier is actually going to go down, because you're going to have more direct labor and you're not going to be able to bill any more for it. So again, you have to kind of look at these in tandem. Go ahead, Brad. So some different things you want to think about with your net fee multiplier. It does correspond to profitability, because it is how much you're billing your clients as compared to the cost that you're putting on those projects, or on your financials as well. Sometimes market conditions can limit your control. Maybe you are bidding on projects and maybe it's very competitive, and you have to keep your bid a little bit lower. You would obviously, then your fee multiplier would be a little bit less. So to make it better, you can increase your fees. Obviously, everybody would do that if they could. Minimize write-offs, again, by having people only posting labor that they're actually working, keeping people scheduled so that they're efficient, and possibly reviewing your proposal writing and estimating, just to make sure you are estimating those fees correctly.
Great. Thanks a lot, Lisa. Lisa touched on, just for a second, the interplay between utilization rate and fee multiplier, or labor multiplier. Hopefully you get the point that those are inversely related, right? If you're going to drive up your utilization rate, you run the risk of running your projects over budget by putting too many hours on the job. That would push up your direct labor, push down the amount of fees in proportion, because you'd run up against your budgets. So emphasizing one or the other is one of those unintended consequences that you actually have working against one another, that it's an initiative that can really not produce any more solid bottom line, because as one is going up, the other can be going down unless they're looked at in tandem. So the third of the big 5 metrics is the answer to that problem, and we call it revenue factor. Revenue factor sometimes is called payroll multiplier because it takes into account all of your payroll dollars, not just the time that is recorded to direct labor. The actual calculation now is not, this is one of the what I call it, more flexible metrics, because you don't really need industry specific software to calculate your revenue factor. You do need, if your revenue factor is an unacceptable number, you do need industry specific metrics to be able to diagnose what's going on. But if you just take your net revenue divided by your total labor dollars, you can get to your revenue factor. Or if you think about how the previous 2 metrics were calculated, the fraction, it is your net fee multiplier, times your utilization rate. So if your utilization rate is 60%, say we held that out as being pretty normal, and the 3.0 multiplier that Lisa referred to a minute ago as kind of being that, let's don't call it successful, but the normal type of multiplier, a 60% utilization rate and a 3.0 multiplier give you a 1.8 revenue factor. Just multiply them together, right? The industry standard where we'd like firms to be is 2.0. And understand revenue factor is so important because it correlates very much more directly to bottom line profit than either of the 2 metrics that go together to create your revenue factor, because it's the counterbalance. It's showing the way in which the firms are managing their utilization rate and their multiplier at the same time. It shows the amount of revenue you're producing for every dollar, and it indicates your firm's performance by how you're balancing the amount of workload and the amount of fees that you can charge. You can increase your revenue factor by being more utilized, by increasing the number of direct hours, and you can increase your revenue factor by charging more for your fee, for your services, or having lower write-offs on your projects. Either one of those will work. Now, the issue is, of course, Lisa mentioned that there can be undesirable impacts from overly too much focus on your utilization rate, because as most of you know, the utilization rate has got a cap. You probably can't get 110% billability out of somebody on a consistent basis. They're going to want to go home at some point, have a work-life balance, as it may. So the utilization rate kind of has a natural governor on it. The other side of the revenue factor, net fee multiplier, has a governor as well. It's called the marketplace. You can only charge so much, but firms have a much bigger degree of control over that piece, over the multiplier, than typically we see in being able to manage that utilization rate. But you'll capture all of that inside the revenue factor by looking at the 2 of them, okay? On the operational influences, I said this before, it's the best indicator of overall profitability, and it's that balance of effort and pricing. If you increase your utilization, if you increase your fees and rates and minimize your write-offs, small improvements in revenue factor can have major impacts on the bottom line. Each one of those ingredients, utilization and multiplier, may not have a direct relationship to bottom line profits as much, but taken together, you kind of get the multiplicative effect. An improvement in both of those then builds together, and a 2.1 revenue factor is a lot in any size firm. Of course, the numbers are relative, but a 2.1 revenue factor is much more profit than a 2.0. And if you can push it up to 2.2, 2.3, you'd be amazed at how much bottom line just mathematically that produces from small changes in either of those 2 ingredients that go into the revenue factor. So I hopefully you've gotten the message at this point. We want to stress revenue factor as one of those key aspects of the big 5. The previous two are important because you need to know those in order to do this, but the revenue factor helps judge where you're balancing utilization and multiplier. Number 4 out of 5 is your overhead rate. Now, overhead rate obviously is not a good indicator of profitability. There are a lot of firms that have very high overhead that make a lot of money, and there are a lot of firms that have very low overhead that don't make much money. This is especially important for firms that work in the government sector, where you've got FAR, federal acquisition regulations, overhead rate guidelines, and allowability rules that you have to worry about. It's basically the costs that you're incurring that are not directly making money, stuff that's not being charged to a job. Now, this is crucially important inside your accounting system. Lisa said, you know, we can't get to a good utilization number unless we're recording all of our time. Overhead is very important if we're not classifying the right costs to overhead versus to the project. I've always used what's called the but-for rule. If not for this project, would we be incurring this cost? If you had no projects at all, you know, the pipeline went empty, went bare, cupboard was bare, would you still have these costs? Those are your overhead costs, okay? One of the big issues here when we talked about this in webinar number 1 is payroll taxes and benefits. Those are an overhead cost. Now, people allocate their time between overhead, which is called indirect labor, and direct labor. So labor can go in either place, but the benefits that you're paying all belong in your overhead in order to properly calculate it. A target, you know, this is highly variable. I hesitated even putting any numbers in here, is 140 to 180%. Now, I suppose some of you that aren't familiar with this might say, well, what does that mean? Understand the AE industry does not calculate overhead as a percentage of sales. It calculates your overhead percentage as a percentage of your direct labor costs. The reason behind that is that you can build up your proper multiplier. If your direct labor costs are 1 and your overhead costs are 1.5, you've got a 2.5 break even, right? You're paying for your labor and you're paying 1.5 times that for your overhead. Everything above that should be dropping to the bottom line in some form, right? So this is the way in which we can build up a proper multiplier that will be sure to pay for your overhead rate. But of course, overhead has operational influences as well. It's difficult many times to fix your overhead rate over a period of time, because the largest component of your overhead in an AE firm is indirect labor by far. So your overhead rate will fluctuate greatly based on your degree of utilization. So here's another one of those interconnectivities, right? You want to increase your utilization rate. It's going to drive down your overhead. So those two things complement each other, as long as that increase in utilization doesn't cause your projects to run over budget and see your revenue drop. So again, all of those 3 things are interrelated, and you've got to make sure that you're looking at them as a set. The goal for overhead in 2021 is to try to be lean without being mean, right? Lean means not spending money that you don't have to, it's not being productive. But mean means you're driving way too hard of a utilization. You're not providing the benefits that employees require these days to stay engaged. That you're really not investing in the things that make the job enjoyable to employees outside of the regular project work. So again, being efficient as far as overhead goes is important, but you really cannot cut yourself to prosperity. Right? There is a reasonable amount of overhead that every firm has to have in order to maintain some degree of sustainability of their operation. So understand, overhead lower is better, but too low starts to have negative impacts as well. Okay. Number 5 is net revenue per employee. This is crucially important in today's market because we've got a huge employee shortage, right? This is a key measurement of efficiency, working smarter rather than harder. This is your net revenue divided by your full-time equivalent employees. Now, FTE means not headcount. This is the total number of hours put in by all of your people divided by the standard hours in a year, which is 2,080, right? 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. That gives you a calculation of how many full-time equivalents your head count, your number of people are putting in, so that if you're making a lot of net revenue per employee based on overtime, you're probably going to have a high utilization rate, but you're also going to have those cultural problems that come with a lot of excess work and a lot of stress from deadlines and too many hours of billable work or project work. And that work-life balance thing can get broken. So this emphasizes working smarter rather than harder, getting paid more per hour for every hour that you put in, as opposed to just making more revenue by putting in more hours. Hopefully that difference rang home for you. This is key important because the difference between your net revenue per full-time equivalent per employee minus your cost, direct labor cost per full-time employee, that gap is what you're trying to maximize. We're trying to make sure that we are having the lowest paid person with the most capability bill their time on the projects to increase that efficiency that allows your higher paid people to be doing the higher level work and going out and marketing more work, managing the company. This number can also be too high and too low, but 130,000 is probably on the low end and 180,000 probably at the top side. I think top performing firms generally hover in that 175 to 180, but it is not difficult. I mean, it's not abnormal to see firms in the $200,000 per person category, okay? What's so important about this? It's tied to those direct labor costs. Obviously, if you have a fixed multiplier of 3 and you pay your people more, then the gap is going to be larger as well. It's that revenue cost gap. And the way in which you can improve this is thinking about leveraging your time, leveraging technology. Combining with higher utilization can be an issue, as I said, but we're looking for a measurement of productivity here. So with those 5, I hope you've understood a little bit of the interconnectivity between them. And we truly believe that, yes, you can supplement these 5 with many, many others, but if you're watching these 5, we will have a pretty complete view of performance and all of the things that you can do to impact that performance. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to questions. If you've got any to enter in there, as Kaylee said, we're not really monitoring the chat at this point, but we will get back to you with any questions that you have about any of these metrics or the way they're calculated, or if you've got some nominations for other ones that you think should be in the top 5 rather than these, I'd love to hear that, and your reasons for saying why you track the ones that you track and not the ones that we track. But you know, our advice is industry-based and very focused on the AE industry, but we don't profess to know it all and use the feedback from these webinars to improve our future webinars and make sure we're bringing information to you guys that you want to hear. So please be sure to answer the survey at the end, and please give us your questions if you've got them. So there's my information, and I'll leave you with Lisa's picture. That's a better picture than mine. Thank you so much for attending this afternoon, and we're glad that you came.